The notification light on my phone blinked 3 times before I even opened my eyes. I knew before I looked. I always knew. Mom, then Brianna, then Dad, then Brianna again. 4 missed calls before 7 in the morning on a Sunday, which meant one of 2 things: somebody was in the hospital or somebody needed money. And since I was the only nurse in the family, I was usually the first call for both. I set the phone face down on my nightstand and stared at the water stain on my apartment ceiling that had been there since I moved in 2 years ago. I'd been meaning to tell my landlord. I never did. There were a lot of things I kept meaning to do that never happened, because my time, like my money, had a way of disappearing before I could spend it on myself. The phone buzzed again. I watched it spin slowly against the wood like a compass that only ever pointed in one direction. I didn't answer. That probably sounds cold, especially coming from someone whose whole career is built around taking care of people. But the thing about being a caretaker professionally is that you learn, eventually, that you cannot pour from an empty cup. My nursing professors told us that in orientation. I believed them then. It took me almost 6 years and 1 devastating credit report to actually live it. My name is Emma Calloway. I'm 29 years old. I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the younger of 2 daughters, and for most of my life, I genuinely believed that being the responsible one was a compliment. Turns out, in some families, responsible is just the pretty word they use for exploitable. My sister Brianna is 3 years older than me and has never once in her adult life paid a bill on time. That's not an exaggeration, it's a documented fact. I know because for years I was the one making sure the lights stayed on, the rent got covered, and the story stayed quiet enough that nobody outside the family ever had to find out. We called it helping. We called it family sticking together. We called it what good daughters do. But we never called it what it actually was. I grew up watching my parents treat Brianna like she was made of blown glass. She was the pretty one, the social one, the one with the laugh that filled a room. I was the quiet one, the studious one, the one who got straight A's and heard good job maybe twice in 18 years. When Brianna dropped out of community college after 1 semester, Mom cried for her. When I graduated nursing school with honors, Mom showed up 40 minutes late because Brianna needed a ride from somewhere. That set the tone for everything that came after. I moved out at 22 and never looked back. Got my own apartment, worked double shifts to pay for my own furniture, my own groceries, my own life. I was proud of that, I still am. But somehow, without me ever agreeing to it, a gravitational pull formed between my bank account and my family's chaos. It started so small I almost didn't notice it happening. Mom called one Tuesday while I was between patients. Her voice had that particular softness she only used when she wanted something sweet and slightly fragile, like she was already preparing for the possibility that I might say no. "Sweetheart, the electric is past due and they're going to cut it off by Friday. Just this one time, could you help us out? $240. I sent it before I got off my break. Told myself it was a one-time thing. The second call came 10 days later. Dad's truck needed a repair or he couldn't get to work. $380. I sent it. I told myself that was the last time. Then Brianna's landlord was threatening to evict her and her husband Derek. Then Mom had a dental bill she'd been ignoring. Then the car insurance lapsed. Then it was Christmas and nobody had money for gifts except me, so somehow that became my responsibility too. I started keeping track in a notes app on my phone the way I tracked medication schedules at work. Dates, amounts, reasons given. Within 8 months, the total was over $6,000. I showed it to Brianna once, not as an accusation, just as information, just to say, hey, this has gotten pretty significant, maybe we should figure out a plan. She looked at the number, looked at me, and said, "You make good money, Emma. We're struggling. I don't know why you're keeping score." That sentence planted something in me. A small, hard seed of something I didn't have a name for yet. But I kept helping. Because that's what you do. Because they're family. Because Mom would always end these calls with "I don't know what we'd do without you," and that felt like love, even if it was a strange, hungry kind of love that left me emptier than before the call. Derek, Brianna's husband, hadn't held a steady job in 2 years. He was working on something, according to Brianna, which translated to spending most afternoons watching television and most evenings complaining about how the economy was rigged against people like him. He was 34 years old. He had a college degree he'd never used. When I asked Brianna once why he wasn't applying to jobs, she said, "He's been through a lot. You wouldn't understand. I let it go. I always let it go." What I didn't understand, what none of them ever explained to me, was exactly what they were spending their money on if they couldn't cover basic bills. Dad had a steady job at a logistics company. Mom worked part-time at a pharmacy. Brianna did occasional freelance work she never described in detail. Derek did nothing, and yet the shortfalls kept coming, month after month, need after need, like a faucet someone had forgotten to turn off. I asked once. Just once. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I'd driven the 2 hours from Phoenix back to Tulsa for my parents' anniversary dinner. A dinner I had offered to cook, which was somehow understood to also mean I would buy all the groceries. I was standing in the kitchen chopping vegetables when Mom mentioned they were behind on the mortgage again. I set down the knife and turned around. "Mom, I've sent you almost $10,000 in the last year. Where is it going?" She got very quiet in that way she did when she was deciding how to be hurt by something. Then she said, "I didn't realize you were keeping such careful track of every little thing you've ever done for this family." And somehow I ended up apologizing. I think about that moment a lot now. How I apologized for asking a reasonable question. How I went back to chopping vegetables and pretended I hadn't said anything. How the dinner was lovely and everyone laughed and nobody mentioned money again, and I drove home in the dark, feeling like I'd swallowed something sharp. The year I turned 28 started out like all the others. Work, long shifts, coffee at 2 in the morning, sending money when the calls came. But something had shifted in me, quietly, the way seasons change before you notice them. I was tired in a different way than before. Not the physical tired of 12-hour shifts, something deeper. A bone-level exhaustion that had nothing to do with how much I slept. I started saying no to small things first, just to practice the shape of the word in my mouth. No, I can't cover the streaming service this month. No, I can't drive up this weekend. No, I can't lend you my credit card for a minute. Each one felt like pulling a thread. The fabric of the family held, barely, but I could feel the tension in it. Then Brianna called me in March with a voice I'd never heard from her before. Lower than usual, almost conspiratorial. "Emma, I need to tell you something and I need you not to freak out." That sentence has never once preceded good news in the history of human conversation. She told me she and Derek were trying to buy a house, that they'd found something they loved in a neighborhood close to Mom and Dad. That the mortgage broker had run their numbers and they didn't quite qualify on their own. And that 2 months ago, without telling me, Mom had called the broker and suggested that my name be added to the application to help them get approved. I stood in my living room and felt the floor tilt. "My name," I said. "Just as a co-signer." "Mom said you wouldn't mind." "Brianna. My name is on a mortgage application. It hasn't gone through yet. They're still processing. When was someone going to tell me?" Silence. Then. "That's kind of why I'm calling." I didn't yell. I wanted to. Instead, I said very calmly that I needed to make some calls, and I got off the phone and I sat on my floor for about 15 minutes not moving. Then I called the mortgage company. Then I called my bank. Then I pulled my credit report for the first time in 8 months. The credit report was the thing that broke me open. There was a credit card I didn't remember applying for. Capital One. The account had been opened 14 months ago. The balance was $11,342. The cardholder of record was Emma R. Calloway. The billing address was my parents' house in Tulsa. I read it 3 times. 4 times. I looked up the account number, called the credit card company, spent 45 minutes on hold. When the representative finally came on, she confirmed that the card had been applied for with my social security number and my date of birth and my name. That it had been opened 14 months ago. That no payments had been made in 6 months. That the account had been sent to collections. I thanked her and hung up and did not cry. I waited until I stopped shaking. Then I drove to the grocery store, bought a bottle of wine I drank slowly over 2 hours, and allowed myself to sit with the full weight of what I'd just learned. Someone in my family, the person with access to my social security number, the person who had my childhood documents, the person who had raised me had opened a credit card in my name without telling me, had spent $11,000 on it, had let it go to collections without ever saying a word. I didn't sleep that night. I spent it pulling every financial thread I could find. I went back through all my old bank statements, all the transfers I'd made, all the requests I'd responded to. I built a spreadsheet the way I charted patient histories, methodically, chronologically, without flinching. By 4 in the morning I had a complete picture of the last 3 years, and the picture was much uglier than I'd let myself believe. My total transfers to my family: $16,800. The credit card opened in my name: $11,300. The mortgage cosign request I'd never agreed to. The car loan inquiry on my credit report I also didn't recognize, though it appeared to have been denied. All of it adding up to something I had to stare at for a long time before I could name it. They hadn't been struggling. Or maybe they had, but not in the way they'd told me. The money I sent wasn't going to electric bills and car repairs and groceries. Somewhere in the accounting of their lives, it was disappearing into something else entirely, and they'd run out of their own resources so completely that they'd started quietly borrowing mine without asking. I called Mom at 8 in the morning. Not screaming, not crying. I had gone past that. I was somewhere on the other side of it, in a place where everything was very clear and very still. I pulled my credit report, I said when she answered. A pause. The kind that means the person on the other end knows exactly what you found. Emma. There's a credit card in my name with $11,000 on it. It's more complicated than it looks. Then explain it to me. What followed was 40 minutes of the most exhausting conversation I have ever had in my life. Mom's voice moved through every register, apologetic, defensive, weepy, matter-of-fact, wounded. She said they'd only meant to use it temporarily. She said Derek had convinced them it was a smart solution while they sorted things out. She said they'd been planning to tell me. She said it wasn't that much money in the grand scheme of things. She said I was making her feel like a criminal when all she'd ever done was try to hold the family together. She said she hoped I knew what it felt like for a mother to have a daughter speak to her this way. I didn't ask what Derek had convinced them to spend $11,000 on. I think part of me didn't want to know yet. Close it, I said, when she finally stopped talking. Call and close the account today. Emma, that's not. Close it, Mom, today. Or I will. She said she would look into it. That was not the same thing as yes, and we both knew it. I called Brianna next. I told her about the credit card. I told her about the mortgage application. I told her about the $16,000 I had tracked in transfers over 3 years. Brianna listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and when I finished, she said, I didn't know about the card. That part I genuinely didn't know. But you knew about the rest. A bit, I mean. I knew things were tight. I didn't know the details. Brianna, I need to know where the money went. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice much smaller than her usual one, she said, Derek had some debts. Before we got married. Some of it was gambling. Mom and Dad were helping him pay it down because I asked them to, and I think they just ran out of ways to cover it. There it was. Right there. The thing nobody wanted to say out loud. I hung up and sat with that for a while. Derek's gambling debts. My parents funneling money to cover them. My money, sent in good faith for electric bills and groceries and car repairs, absorbed into a quiet financial sinkhole that everyone around me had known about and decided, collectively, that I didn't need to know. That I would just keep giving, and they would just keep taking, and nobody would ever have to say it plainly. I thought about every phone call. Every time Mom's voice went soft. Every time Dad said, we're lucky to have you, kiddo. Every time I drove to the grocery store and filled bags for people who were smiling at me because they knew I wouldn't say no. Not because I was generous. Because I was managed. I drove up to Tulsa that Saturday. I didn't call ahead. I just showed up at the house I grew up in, the one I had been quietly subsidizing for years, and knocked on the door like a visitor because that's what I was now. A visitor. Or maybe something less than that. A resource someone had run out of patience waiting to tap. Mom answered in her housecoat, surprised, but not entirely. She'd been waiting for this conversation the way people wait for weather they know is coming, pretending they haven't seen the clouds. Dad came into the living room when he heard my voice. Brianna and Derek were there, which I hadn't expected, but probably should have. It had all the staging of a conversation that had been rehearsed beforehand. I sat down. I didn't take off my jacket. I want to understand what happened to the money, I said. Not accusatory, just clear. Not the version where everyone is the victim. The actual version. Dad started with the recession. Things had gotten tight, markets shifted, his hours were cut. Mom talked about how they'd wanted to help Brianna and Derek get stable before starting a family. Derek sat very still and looked at his hands. Brianna looked at me with something in her eyes that wasn't quite an apology, more like a plea. The story that emerged, piece by piece, was this. Derek had accumulated nearly $30,000 in gambling debts before marrying Brianna. My parents had known and agreed to help cover it quietly, to protect Brianna's marriage and to keep Derek from having to face consequences that might have embarrassed the family. They'd used their own savings first. When those ran out, they started using money I sent them, redirecting it, telling themselves it was temporary, telling themselves they'd pay it back before I ever needed to know. And when that wasn't enough, Mom said it was Derek's idea, Dad said everyone agreed, had opened the credit card using my information, because I had good credit and they no longer qualified for anything. I sat with all of it for a long moment, looking around the room at the furniture, the framed photos on the wall, the normalcy of a living room that had been secretly on fire for years. How long? I said. Emma, how long did you plan to keep doing this? Mom's eyes filled. We were going to tell you. We just needed a little more time. You've been taking money from me for 3 years and running a credit card in my name, and the plan was to need a little more time. You don't know how hard it's been, Dad said. His voice was even. Almost reasonable. The voice he used when he wanted to sound like the calm one in the room. Derek was in trouble. Brianna needed support. You were doing well. You could afford it. I looked at him, my father. The man who had shrugged when I graduated nursing school, who had never once asked what my dreams were, who had called me capable so many times, I'd started to understand it as code for something less kind. I could afford it, I repeated. Emma, be reasonable, Brianna said. We're family. Derek made mistakes. People make mistakes. You're acting like we stole from you. You opened a credit card in my name without telling me, I said. What word would you prefer? Derek spoke for the first time. He had the particular energy of someone who had been caught and decided that offense was better than accountability. Look, it's not like you were struggling. You've got a good salary, your own place. We were drowning. I don't know what you want from us. And there it was. The entitlement, clean and honest for probably the first time. You have enough, so what we did doesn't count. You were the lifeboat, so it doesn't matter that we climbed in without asking. Mom stood up, her voice went sharp and loud in the way it did when she wanted to end conversations she wasn't winning. Emma, you have always made everything about you. We are your family. We are asking for help. If you were really the kind of daughter you think you are, you would find a way to fix this with us instead of sitting there making us feel like criminals. I stood up. I put on my jacket. I'm not going to fight about this, I said. But I want you all to hear me clearly. I'm filing a report about the credit card. Not to hurt anyone, but because there is a fraudulent account in my name and I have to protect my own credit. I'm removing my name from the mortgage cosign. I will not be sending any more money. Dad's jaw tightened. Emma. And if anyone opens anything in my name again, I will file a police report. I love you. I mean that. But I'm done. Brianna's voice followed me down the hallway. So that's it? You're just going to let us deal with this alone? You're really going to do this to us? I didn't answer. I walked to my car, got in, and drove 2 blocks before I pulled over and sat for a while, engine running, hands on the wheel. Not crying. Just breathing. Taking inventory of myself the way I would a patient after a difficult procedure, checking for damage, making sure everything essential was still intact. I drove home. The calls started the next morning and they didn't stop for 2 weeks. Mom every day, sometimes twice. Dad 3 times in one afternoon with escalating urgency. Brianna alternating between furious and pleading depending on the time of day, which I came to understand meant Derek was coaching her on messaging. He called once himself, a single voicemail that was more negotiation than apology, explaining that the debts had mostly been paid off now, and this was all really water under the bridge if I was willing to look at it practically. I didn't respond to any of them. I contacted a consumer protection attorney who walked me through the process of disputing the fraudulent account. I froze my credit. I sent a certified letter to the mortgage company withdrawing my name from any application I had not personally signed. I started rebuilding the part of my financial life that had been quietly hollowed out while I wasn't looking. There were moments in those 2 weeks when the guilt hit hard enough to take my breath. Usually at night, usually when I was too tired to argue with it. The image of my parents' house, of the hallway with the family photos, of Mom's voice going small and frightened. The memory of every birthday, every Christmas, every ordinary Tuesday when I'd called them just to say hi before any of this started. Love is complicated when the people you love have hurt you. It doesn't just turn off. I wish it did. It would be so much easier if it did. But then I'd pull up the spreadsheet. I'd look at the dates and the amounts and the careful, deliberate architecture of what they'd done, not in a moment of desperation, but over years, slowly, methodically, while looking me in the eyes and calling it family. And the grief would harden into something else. Not hatred. Not even anger. Just the cold, clarifying recognition that what I had believed was love had certain conditions attached that I was never told about, and one of the conditions was my silence. My aunt reached out in week 3, Mom's sister, who I'd always been close to. She'd heard a version of the story that bore only a passing resemblance to the actual one. In the version my family told, I had discovered some minor financial arrangement I'd misunderstood and blown it into a catastrophe out of anger and selfishness. My aunt was kind about it. She said she was sure there had been a miscommunication and she hoped I would think about what it meant to cut off the people who raised you over money. I told her I hadn't cut anyone off. I had stopped subsidizing a situation that had crossed into something I could not in good conscience continue to enable. I told her about the credit card, the amounts, the mortgage application. I heard her go very quiet on the other end of the line. She said she hadn't known about all of that. I told her I believed her. She called me back 2 days later. Said she'd talked to Mom. Said Mom had cried and said I was exaggerating. Said she didn't know what to believe. I told her I understood and that I hoped we could stay in touch regardless. I meant it. Dad sent an email 6 weeks after I stopped answering calls. It was long and carefully written, which meant he had drafted it multiple times, which meant somewhere in him he understood that language mattered here. He said he was sorry for the pain this had caused. He said he should have been upfront with me. He said the family had been under pressure. I didn't fully understand, not as an excuse, but as context. He said Derek had come a long way and deserved a chance. He said Mom was not well and that my absence was making things harder for her. He said he hoped I would consider coming back to the table. I read it several times. I appreciated the honesty in it, or the approximation of honesty. But I noticed he didn't mention the credit card except as the financial situation. I noticed he didn't say anything about what would change. I noticed the whole email was a very gentle case for me to return to exactly where things were before, positioned as reconciliation but structured as a request for a second chance to need things from me. I wrote back. It took me 3 drafts. I told him I loved him and I always would. I told him I was not ready to talk on the phone yet, but I was open to continuing to communicate by email. I told him that if we were going to rebuild anything, it would have to start with honesty, full honesty, about the credit card and the money and what it had been used for. and that I would need to see real changes in how the family managed finances before I could be involved again in any meaningful way. I told him that I was not punishing anyone. I was protecting myself, and that those were not the same thing. He read it. He did not reply for 8 days. When he did, it was 3 sentences. He said he understood. He said he missed me. He said he hoped I would be patient with them. I'm still waiting to find out what that means in practice. My apartment is quiet on Sunday mornings now, in a way it hasn't been for years. I make coffee and sit by the window and look at the parking lot and think about the strange mathematics of it all, what I gave and what I got back, and how long it took me to understand the exchange rate. I'm not angry anymore, mostly. Anger burns too much fuel to maintain at distance. What I am is awake. I see things now I looked away from for years. I understand now that the love I was given came packaged with expectations I never agreed to, dressed up in family language so I wouldn't notice the transaction underneath. You don't question it when you're inside it. You just keep giving, keep adjusting, keep telling yourself it'll balance out eventually. Because if you stop and look at the numbers, really look, you might have to admit that the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally had actually loved you very specifically, in proportion to your usefulness. And that is a grief that takes a long time to hold. But here is what I know now, sitting in this quiet on a Sunday morning, with my credit score slowly climbing back to where it was and my savings account actually growing for the first time in 3 years. I know that my value does not live in what I can provide. I know that setting a limit is not the same as abandoning people. I know that you can love someone entirely, fully, without funding their choices. And I know, maybe most importantly, that the people who respond to your no with cruelty or manipulation or guilt are revealing something important about the nature of what they were offering you in the first place. I think about Brianna sometimes. I think about who she might have become if someone had let her be uncomfortable earlier, before the stakes were this high. I think about Derek and whether he's still gambling or whether the consequences finally caught up enough to change anything. I think about Mom and whether she knows, in the part of herself that doesn't get to use family as a shield, what she actually did. And I think about me, 22 years old, packing my car and driving to Phoenix with my nursing degree and my whole life ahead of me, excited and terrified and already convinced that love meant making yourself available. I would tell her something different now. I would tell her that generosity is beautiful, but it needs a floor, a point below which you don't go regardless of who's asking. I would tell her to pull her credit report every 6 months and not feel guilty for doing it. I would tell her that capable and obligated are not synonyms, no matter how many times someone uses one to mean the other. I would tell her that the people who love you well will not need to borrow your identity to survive. And I would tell her that when someone tells you to get out and come back when you're ready to contribute more, that the kindest thing you can do for yourself and maybe even for them is to take them at their word. I did. And if you're listening to this, I think some part of you already knows the story I'm telling is yours too, not the details maybe, but the weight of it. The exhaustion, the long, slow dawning that you have been loving people who were measuring you in a currency you never agreed to. So I guess my question is the same one I've been sitting with all these months, out here in the quiet I built for myself, one boundary at a time. Was I wrong to stop? Was there a version of this where I could have fixed it from the inside, stayed generous, stayed connected, and still somehow made it out intact? Or was walking away the only thing left that was genuinely mine to give?